What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the fighting game tutorial series, we're going to be going over the first part of practice mode and training mode settings. If I come into my main menu here and go to the practice mode, and I will launch up a practice session. When we come in here, we want to be able to have the ability to open up a practice settings menu. That way we can do things like change the AI behavior or health regeneration or super meter regeneration of the dummy character here. Right now we're just going to make it so the menu pops up when we're in practice mode, and only in practice mode when we press the right shift button or an options button on an Xbox controller. And so we have this practice settings menu. It's got a transparent background on it, and each setting will be shown here in this vertical box. So setting name, and we'll have some sort of option here. Could be a button, might be a slider, could be a drop down, however we want to handle it. Right now I just have a button that says disabled on it, and then we would be able to go in and enable these options. And for now that's all I have, but just note that this is a different button than the pause button. This is the right shift button, so we don't have to make any changes to our pause menu if you don't want to. However, some games do put these practice mode options on the pause menu as an option or as another tab. For me, I wanted to keep it so I could press one singular button and open up the settings and then close this when I'm done with it. I actually didn't implement a close in this episode. That'll be the next episode of practice settings, so right now they just keep stacking. But as long as we have the appropriate number of settings being generated with an option here, a button here to start, we'll know that this is working. And we shouldn't be able to open this in versus mode. So quickly, if I go in here and launch versus mode, when I press my right shift button, nothing will happen, and it doesn't. So we know we've done it correctly. That is a practice mode only menu. Now, before we get started in this series, if you want to check out how we've done everything from our attacks, our screen shake, our health bars, all this fun stuff, you can click this iCard in the top right corner right here to get caught up on all that by looking at the fighting game tutorial playlist. Alternatively, if you don't care about that and you only care about the practice mode settings, I do recommend you look at this episode right here, which is where we initially put up the practice and training mode behavior, because we are going to be building on top of that today. With that out of the way, we can go ahead and get started. So this is a code and blueprint tutorial series, and we are going to need to work in both. We're going to start in the code today. Before we do that, let's add a new binding. We're going to add one for this options menu. So if you're following my behavior, go ahead and go to your edit project settings, scroll down to input, and in here you can add an action mapping. Again, if you're using enhanced input, you can create an enhanced input action and handle it that way, but I'm just using the regular action mapping still. This works in Unreal Engine 4 and Unreal Engine 5. So I added a new one by pressing this plus here, and then I scrolled down to it, and I called it Options Input. That's because I had one that was called Start Input, and this handles my pausing of the game, skipping character entrances, and other things like that. I wanted this button to be kind of the same, so I'm making it generic. I'm not adding P1 or P2 to it. It's just Options Input, and I've added my keyboard input as well as my gamepad input. So my keyboard input, I've used right shift, and for my gamepad input, I've added gamepad special left. You can add another input action by pressing the plus right here, and then searching for what you want. So gamepad special left. Once you have your input action here, remember this name, you can copy it if you want. It's called Options Input for me. I'm going to close out of this menu. Now I'm going to go to Visual Studio. In here, we need to handle this input. That's the first thing we're going to worry about. So to do that, let's go to our base player controller.h, and let's make a new function. So I'm scrolling down, and I'm making a function called Perform Options Input Logic. Again, I'm mimicking the Perform Start Input Logic. So the point of this function is to handle that input whenever we press right shift or the gamepad special left and determine what's going to happen. Right now, the only thing that we want to look for is if we're in practice mode. That way we can create the practice settings widget. I made it ufunction a blueprint callable, so we can call it in the blueprint. I actually don't need to today, so you could leave it out if you want. Now we can go to the base player controller.cpp and scroll down to setup input component. Toward the bottom of this function, I was handling start input right here, and so we're going to do the same behavior for this, just calling the proper function. So input component, arrow, bind action. We want to use our name of our input action. This is why I was saying keep track of it. For me, it is options input. IE_pressed means when we press this input is when we are going to call this function. this is the object it is being called on. We are in a player controller. We're calling this player controller's function. So this represents this instance of the player controller. That's perfectly fine. And then we're calling a base player controller perform options input logic. So now our binding, when we press right shift or that options button, we'll call it this function. We need to go and make this function. So I'm going to scroll down. And here's my perform start input logic. Again, pretty similar as this, so I put it right under this behavior. Void a base player controller, : perform options input logic. Now the first thing I did was add a log just to make sure that it was firing as intended. I've already commented this out, but if you want to use it to make sure it's working, by all means do it. It's just UE log. I use log temp with a warning, which will make it yellow. And for the actual text, I put perform options input logic called from player controller. The next thing we need to do is get our game mode, because the game mode can call functions to create widgets and create the practice settings, just like how we've done some of our other widgets. But more importantly, it knows the match state. The match state is essentially where we're at in the match. So if we're in the character entrances, if we're playing the stage intro, if we're actually fighting, if the fight has ended, and most importantly, it knows if the match has not actually started yet. If we're just on a default value, which usually means we're in a menu, we don't want to be able to pull up the practice settings if we're not in the practice mode. For example, we don't want to be able to pull it up on the main menu. So we're going to get our game mode, and if it's valid, we'll check that value. So get world, get auth game mode for get authority game mode, and we're going to cast that value to a fighter template game mode. This is the game mode that our game is currently using for all of our modes, all of our maps. If this cast succeeds, it's going to get set to this game mode variable here. So if game mode is valid, we come into the if statement. Then we're going to use the game mode to check the match state. Make sure it is not equal to eMatch state : e_default. As the comment says here, if the match state is not the default value, usually meaning the game is currently on a menu or is launched without entering any specific mode. That's what the default state means. So let's update this real quick. Default usually means the game is currently on a menu or is launched without entering any specific mode. So we don't want to do it if it's default. That makes sense. If it's not default, that means we are in a match of some sort. So we can go to the next if statement here. At this point, we're going to need our game instance, because the game instance knows what type of match we're in, such as versus, story, practice, and whatever else we may have. So to do that, we can just call get game instance, then cast it to our game instance that we have for our game, which is base game instance. If that succeeds, it will get set to this auto game instance variable. Then we will go inside the if statement, and we need to check and see if the game instance game mode type is equal to game mode type : e_practice. So if the current mode is practice or training mode. Otherwise, we don't want to be able to open practice settings, so there's no reason to do anything with this. Now once we're at this point, we've already pressed the button, we're in the right mode, we're ready to open up the practice settings. But to do that, we need a function. So I'm going to go to my fighter template game mode.h, and I'm going to scroll down to where my pause game function is, because it's very similar to that. And I'm going to make a new function here, void open practice settings. I am going to pass in a parameter of a base player controller pointer called owning player. This is going to be the player that's owning that widget. I've made it a U function, that is blueprint implementable event. This means that we can call it in the code, but we'll handle the functionality in the blueprint. Once you've created this function, you can go back to your base player controller.cpp, and we can use our game mode to call that function now. So game mode, arrow, open practice settings, and we're going to pass in this. We're already in the base player controller, so whatever player controller is calling this function is the player controller that we want to give control to for this menu. Now with this stuff out of the way, we can go ahead and go back to the editor. The editor is back open, so we can go ahead and create our widget now. So the first thing we're going to do is go to where we want to add the widget. I'm going to go to my Blueprints Widgets Menus folder. Going to go to Add, User Interface, and Widget Blueprint. If you're in Unreal Engine 4, that would have been enough. If you're in Unreal Engine 5, you do have to pick the parent class. The regular user widget is perfectly fine, so go ahead and click that. So I called mine practice settings. Once you have that set up, go ahead and go into it. For the actual design of the widget, I have my scale box and size box. These are things that I use to make sure it's always the proper size based on the window. I have specific episodes to go over more in-depth details about this, but I will go ahead and give a quick overview now. So I have a scale box that I brought in. You can search for a scale box. That's my first element here. It is set to scale to fit with a stretch direction of both. You can see everything here is default. This is just a standard scale box, and I put a size box in there. This is another widget element here, size box. The size box is set to center horizontally and vertically, and it has min desired width and height of the size I want the widget to be. So if you look at the selection up here in the top left, it says selection 1920 by 1080. That's why I'm using these values as my min desired width and min desired height. Everything else in here is standard. Then I have a canvas panel, which again you can search for it, canvas panel. This is a basic canvas panel. You can follow my settings here, but you don't actually have to change anything. Then I've added a text element right here that I've called practice settings title text. This is just the title for the widget. It's that simple. I have it anchored to the top center here. And my positions are -960 for the X, 40 for the Y, with a size of 1920 by 80. And the reason I'm doing this is so that I know it stays centered between here, even if we're changing the text. So if I want to make this something else, like practice long settings, it would still stay in the center. It's not required you do that if you don't plan on changing this text at all. But I like to show you guys different ways to do things. Here's my style information. So I'm using Roboto font, bold, 48, outline size of 4, and I'm centering it in the justification. Good to go. Now, next thing I need, and this is the most important, is this vertical box. So we can go and add a vertical box, add it to the canvas panel. And I called mine practice settings vertical box, and I made sure that I checked is variable because we're going to need this in the next episode. For the anchors, I anchored it to the center, position of 0 for the X and Y, 130 for the size because I'm using size to content, so they don't really matter here. The alignment is 0.5 for the X and Y, just to use the center of the vertical box as the placement on the anchor instead of the origin. If I made the 0, .5 and 0.5 is what we want. All the rest is default behavior for vertical boxes. I've added some widgets in here, but we're actually going to need to create this widget. So I'm going to make a new widget right here in the same place, widget blueprint, and I'm calling this one practice settings row. This is going to be the individual elements within the vertical box. So once you make practice settings row, go into it. In here, I've added a default canvas panel. Again, no change, just so I can have a container element here, keep everything together. I have a text widget that I call setting name, and it is a variable because we are going to change the name of the setting based on the setting that we're having, right? So if this is CPU behavior, of course, that's what it's going to say. It's not going to say setting name. This is anchored to the top left. These are my positions and sizes, size to content, and I give it a Z order of 2, just so it can appear above everything. 1 would also be fine, and I'm just going to make it 1 to make it easier to understand. I had this set up a little bit differently when I was going through it, and so I set it to 2, but it just needs to be 1. The text is setting name by default. You can put whatever you want in here. Again, here's my font, my outline size, all this behavior. I have it justified on the left, and no other changes down below. Then I've added a button, just a standard button here, that I've called setting option. And I made that a variable because we may change the text on here, and we're going to use it for focusing when we're navigating this menu with controller or keyboard. Anchored to top left still, position of 820, size of 280 and 80, Z order of 1 just to appear above the border here. For the style of the button, I use the style that I normally do for all my buttons, so button var 1 for normal, hovered is button P1 hover var 1, and pressed is button P1 selected and hovered, or SAH. Then for my pressed and hovered sound, I actually put in my sound effects that I've been using throughout the series. So confirm 1 is my pressed sound and hovered sound is tick. And there you go, that's our button. Then I have text on that button. You can drag a text element onto a button, it will create it, but you can only have 1 child, so I can't do it because I've already done it. I've called this text SOB text. It actually stands for the setting option button text, not SOB text. And I just put the text in here right now as disabled until we know what exactly we want to say with it. Here's my font sizes, my outlines, all that good stuff. You can slow this down if you want to look at anything I have, but most of it is default. Lastly, I have my settings border, which is actually just an image widget here. It is a variable in case you want to change it, but it's not really needed. Anchor top left, here are my positions and sizes. For my brush, I'm using my command list border image, so the same image that I'm using in my command list for those elements. And we're good to go. There's nothing in the graph as of this episode. It's completely empty. Now we can go back to practice settings, and what I did was just add a few of these just to see how it looks. So practice settings row, and I added them to the vertical box. You can add as many or as little as you'd like. We're actually going to create them dynamically. Unless you have a set number you know you want to use, then of course feel free to do that. But this will be covered in the next episode. And for now, I just have this hard-coded amount of 5. So I just literally brought it in 5 times to get all these rows. Now, we don't have to do anything with them. Again, this is just temporary to make sure that we are liking the actual view or design of our widget. I'm going to ignore them for now. Lastly, I've added a background image on my practice settings widget here. So this is just another image. And I didn't make this one a variable. I don't intend to change the background of the practice settings at runtime or anything like that. For the anchor, I made it the full size of the widget. Here are my offsets. Z order of -1, so it does appear behind everything. For my brush, I just changed the tint of no image to this gray color, so you can use my colors if you want or not. It's up to you. And the rest is default behavior. Now we need to actually spawn this widget to the screen to make sure we're doing it correctly, and we can do that using the open practice settings function that we made in the code earlier. Remember, that was a blueprint implementable event on our game mode, so we're going to go to our game mode blueprint, or in my case default game mode BP, and I'm just going to go to wherever there's some blank space, and I'm going to search for this open practice settings event that we created. So open practice settings. When you type that in, you'll get this node right here. It should have the owning player because we added that as a parameter to the function. We are going to right click and call create widget, and then for construct we're going to choose the class here of practice settings. We want the whole practice settings, not just an individual row. And for the owning player, we're going to pass that in from the event into the owning player on the create widget. Then we're going to drag off the return value of the widget and type add to viewport so we can actually add it to what the player can see. And that's how we get this right here. At that point, we are good to go, and you can open up your practice settings in your practice mode. Anyway, guys, that's all I got for today, so thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe and consider joining the Patreon, YouTube membership, or Discord subscriptions to support the channel and this series further. If you ran into any issues while following this tutorial or while following any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. There's a link in the description, and I would be happy to help you out. Thank you again so much for watching, guys. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, my friends.